Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We have a lot of great content today, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. It's at the hour, and we'll have others trickle in as we start the presentation. So we are welcome to APM Connect. We launched about a year ago, more over a year ago, with Team Connect, focusing on the transform episode accountability model specific to mandatory bundles in the hospital. We have since grown to support other mandatory models and shared insights, including ASM and now the proposed CJRX. So welcome ASM Connect. If you have not joined, it is free to ambulatory specialty participants, hospitals, ACOs. If you are a provider in this space, it is free to you all. We have this great presentation today. We're going to follow it up June 18th with another webinar specific to the collaborative care agreements. That's a requirement under ASM. I know there's been a lot of questions on what that should look like. We have some great experts coming in to share ideas about templates and the CCA requirements. And then we also have the ASM Connect roundtable following that the next week on June 25th, and we can bounce ideas off of what we've heard from both this webinar and the one in June. So thank you for joining. Please visit if you have not and become a member. Today, I am privileged and honored to share the stage with Amanda Lord. We're going to talk about the ASM Reality Check, a conversation on specialty value-based care. As a P360 principal, Amanda is the senior policy executive. She leads the strategic direction and execution of P360 regulatory and compliance framework for the CMS Quality Payment Program. Her primary focus is on maintaining the P30 elite status as a qualified clinical data registry, mitigating regulatory risk and ensuring clients can successfully navigate the complexity of value-based care reimbursement. So today we're going to have a fireside chat going through different topics of ASM, getting into the details. We'll start high level at the big picture. Also, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. We'll hold questions till the end of the presentation, and if we don't have time, we will follow up directly with you all on those questions. Welcome again to our presentation. Today, we're diving into one of the most important new developments coming out of CMS Innovation Center, rulemaking, the new Mandatory Ambulatory Specialty Model, or ASM. This model represents a major shift from specialty providers, especially those involved in heart failure and low back pain management. Unlike many previous value-based care programs, ASM is mandatory. So that carries an increasing financial risk over time, and it fundamentally changes how specialists will be measured and reimbursed. Our goal today is not just to review the rule, but talk about the operational reality behind it. What specialists should be paying attention to now, what your organizations may be underestimating, and how practices can begin preparing before the 2027 performance year begins. We also want this to feel very conversational and practical. So throughout the discussion, we'll focus on real-world implications for specialists, ACOs, clinically integrated networks, and practice leadership teams. So let's get started. We've seen a lot of voluntary models come and go, but the ASM Reality Check sounds a bit more urgent. Why did you choose that title? What is the reality that specialists are waking up to right now, Amanda?
Thanks, Rhiannon. Well, the reality really is that the era of the optional value-based care, it's really ending. For a long time, specialists could stay in their MIPS lane and be fine. Different members of a group could essentially hide behind other high-performing scorers in the group. And the group could also report on their best measures. And for some in the group, they wouldn't even be impacted because there weren't measures that they were even using anyway. So ASM really changes the math. It's a reality check because for many, this really isn't a choice anymore. It's a mandatory shift in how their business operates, and it's comparing specialist to specialist, peer-to-peer, apples to apples.
Definitely, much so. And there's been a lot of discussion about ASM since the final rule was released, but many organizations are still trying to understand why CMS created the model and what it signals about the future direction of specialty and value-based care. Why do you think CMS specifically chose heart failure and low back pain as the first two ASM cohorts?
Well, a few key reasons. First, it's not about the money, but it's always about the money, right? It has a high economic impact. So these conditions represent a significant share of Medicare spending. Heart failure, according to the final rule, accounts for 3.5%, and low back pain cohort accounts for the 2.7% of total Medicare Part A and B expenditures. Also, both conditions already have established episode-based cost measures. Those are those EBCMs that you see under MIPS. So this makes them ready for immediate application in this model. And finally, there's really a need for care coordination. So CMS selected these because they're high volume conditions where specialists commonly provide longitudinal management in ambulatory settings and where there is significant room to improve outcomes through better integration with primary care.
So thinking about those comments and why they started there, what does the model tell us about where CMS Innovation Center is heading strategically?
So I see it as a big pivot to specialty care because historically the Innovation Center has focused its integration and care coordination models heavily on behaviors and practice patterns in primary care. ASM marks a deliberate strategic shift to directly engage specialists in value-based payment. By targeting high volume, high cost chronic conditions like heart failure and low back pain, CMS is going straight to the source of significant Medicare spending and placing the accountability squarely on the specialists who manage those conditions. The final rule explicitly states that ASM is aligned with the Innovation Center newly announced strategy, which is built on three core pillars. You've got preventing disease through evidence-based practices, empowering patients, because we know through those functional measures that we've seen within the set, the patient voice is becoming increasingly more important, and then driving choice and competition through individual accountability. So CMS is moving away from group level reporting toward individual clinician level TIN NPI performance, aiming to create a level playing field for those solo and small practices and removing reporting benefits previously held by large health systems.
Wow, that's a lot. And the model officially runs through 2027 through 2031. And we're already hearing a lot of chatter about getting ready right now with just over 6 months left in 2026. Why is it important to prepare? Why is this preparation window such a big deal?
Yeah, so CMS actually released the preliminary list. I'm sure many of you have seen it a few months back. It's the preliminary list, and that was in early 2026. And they used data from 2024 for that, specifically to give everyone almost a year of runway before the official January 2027 start. That lead time is absolutely critical for two main reasons. First, there's the operational side. Yeah, so clinicians really need this time to build out new workflows, like setting up the formal collaborative care arrangements. Those are the CCAs that we've read so much about with primary care providers. They also have to get their EHRs and all of their IT systems ready to capture those ECQMs, right? That's going to be a big deal that we'll talk about more. And also the patient-reported outcomes. So you really can't just flip a switch on these kinds of technical upgrades overnight. It takes time. And second, it's really about establishing a baseline here in 2026. So now, while no one will know the official ASM median scores for these cohorts until the 2027 performance year actually concludes, CMS is using existing mixed cost measures for this model, as you have seen. So that means we already have historical national benchmarks for these measures. So this prep window is giving organizations the time to run their own claims data, calculate their current episode costs, and compare those against the historical benchmarks. So you have to estimate your starting position relative to the rest of the country so you can try to course correct before the actual financial penalties kick in.
With such a short time frame and runway to get ready, from your perspective, Amanda, what are organizations underestimating most right now about ASM?
Yeah, so I think there's three major paradigm shifts that organizations are really not prepared for right now. First, it's the mandatory individual peer comparison. So under traditional MIPS, as many of you are familiar with, a clinician's performance is assessed against the entire massive pool of all clinicians, regardless of what specialty they are or what services they provide. ASM completely changes that dynamic. So it's scoring clinicians individually at the TIN NPI level and comparing their performance only against other specialists who are treating the exact same chronic condition. So you can no longer hide behind a large group average or a diluted national pool. Second, they're underestimating the mandatory reporting set of measures. So we're so used to MIPS and MVP world, right, where clinicians get to pick and choose the measures they want to report, which usually means picking the ones that they're already scoring well on. Yeah, I mean, it's the path of least resistance. Who's not going to do that? So ASM is really throwing that flexibility out of the window. It's requiring clinicians to report on a very specific fixed set of measures that CMS has deemed clinically relevant for that specific cohort. The cherry picking era is really over for these cohorts. And third, and I really think this might be the most impactful, is that the direct link to the patient's voice. So for years, we've seen legacy programs like PQRS, MIPS focused on heavily checking the boxes for those process-based measures. ASM is aggressively shifting the focus to outcomes by featuring those patient-reported outcomes measures or PROMs. CMS explicitly states that this is designed to elevate the patient's voice, meaning that a clinician's actual payment adjustment is going to be directly tied to whether the patient reports the improvement or decline in their functional status over time.
You mentioned PQRS back in the day and MIPS and participation in MIPS. In ASM, is this really, I've heard this thrown around, MIPS 2.0, or is ASM fundamentally different than MIPS?
So on the surface, okay, some foundational items are very similar and definitely feel like a repackaging, similar to how it felt during the shift between MIPS and MVPs. We're using the same, the quality measures that we're all familiar with. Those are in the program, right? Performance categories are the ones we all know. Also, MIPS eligible and ASM mandatory clinicians face a similar maximum negative payment adjustment for failing to participate, which starts at that 9% that we're all familiar with. But when you look a little bit more closely, here's where the fundamental differences are most noticeable. So first, it's strictly a mandatory model for these specialists. CMS noted that voluntary models often face selection bias and participant attrition when financial gains are uncertain. So making it mandatory ensures everyone's on a level playing field. Second, it's eliminating the cherry picking of measures, right? So as I mentioned, in MIPS and MVPs, there's a lot of flexibility and choice. In ASM, all the measures in your cohort set are required. So that makes sure that the selection bias is essentially removed from the equation. And then third, the magnitude of the risk is higher, okay? ASM introduces a two-sided financial risk that scales up over the test period. So it's going to start at a 9% risk level and it's going to eventually reach 12%, which pushes the financial stakes higher than the typical MIPS adjustments because it's not about the money, but it's always about the money. And then fourth is the focused peer comparison. So instead of being graded against a massive, diverse national pool of Medicare providers, participants are compared strictly to others within their specific cohort. So cardiologists treating heart failure are only compared to other cardiologists treating heart failure. And finally, the scoring weights are fixed. So ASM places 100% of your base score on a 50-50 quality cost split. The other two categories, and this is a big deal because it's totally different than MIPS, improvement activities and promoting interoperability are only used as potential negative scoring adjustments if you fail to meet those requirements. And we'll talk about that more in just a bit.
Great. So it eliminates selection bias, eliminates the cherry picking. It is higher risk, peer comparison focused, and has totally different scoring mechanisms. So let's look at the participant list and dive into the invite list of ASM. One of the biggest questions organizations are asking right now is, are we actually included? So let's break it down how eligibility works. And I think as everyone looked at this list, there were lots of surprises. CMS finalized the eligibility at the individual clinician level. Why is it important operationally to look at this at the clinician level?
So that's a great question because operationally, it's going to change everything for organizations that are used to just rolling everything up and submitting data as a group under MIPS. CMS was extremely intentional about finalizing eligibility at the TIN NPI level instead of the group TIN level. Operationally, this is a huge shift for a few reasons. So first, it's really all about transparency and leveling the playing field. CMS clearly stated in the rule that evaluating clinicians individually removes the unequal reporting and scoring benefits that large consolidated health systems and group practices have historically experienced. In a group reporting setup, it's easy to hide lower performing or high cost clinicians behind the average score of the broader group. By pulling eligibility and scoring down to the NPI individually, CMS is forcing a direct and unavoidable accountability. Second, it's allowing for true peer-to-peer comparisons. So ASM is fundamentally about comparing specialists directly to other specialists treating the exact same condition. And to do that fairly and accurately, CMS has to strip away the group average and evaluate the individual clinician to ensure an apples-to-apples comparison. And finally, it's reflecting the modern reality of how specialists work. CMS noted that many specialists practice across multiple services and locations or teams, so a strict group-based approach just doesn't capture the whole picture. By tracking that specific TIN-NPI combination, CMS can accurately identify claims for a single provider, even if they bill under multiple different TINs. So, while tracking everything at the individual NPI level is absolutely going to cause some operational headaches for practices used to group reporting, for CMS, the individual level focus is a deliberate feature. It's not a bug. So one win I do want to call out in all the what sounds to be like doom and gloom, right? Is that they did finalize regarding individual submissions is that CMS has a major flexibility that's allowing for small practices defined as a single practice with 15 or fewer clinicians, same as MIPS, to report their quality measures at the group or TIN level. So that's good. And then additionally, based on overwhelming feedback, they're actually also allowing all participant TINs, regardless of size, to report the improvement activities and promoting interoperability at the group level, since those activities naturally reflect practice-wide efforts. So those are a few wins that I wanted to call out based on the final rule. Now, I like the win, right? But it did give me pause after everything that I've just said, right? It gave me pause because their strict individual accountability philosophy, right? It seems to contradict that. But I really think they had to make some sort of compromise because they essentially had two priorities colliding here, yeah? It's on the one hand, they want strict individual accountability. On the other hand, they want to protect small independent practices from being crushed by administrative burden. During the comment period, smaller practices made it very clear that they simply don't have the IT infrastructure, staffing, resources to aggregate and report data down to the individual clinician level. We know this to be true firsthand at Patient 360. We've seen it as many of our small practices that we support are already stretched thin managing their current administrative needs. So I think CMS realized through those comments that if they force the issue, the sheer burden of individual reporting might actually force these small practices to close or consolidate into massive hospital systems, which actually defeats their strategic pillar of driving competition. So allowing small practices to report quality at the group level is a lifeline to keep them independent. But CMS did include a warning. So they explicitly stated they're going to monitor performance of these small practices very closely to determine if they need to pull this flexibility and force individual reporting in the future. And this is directly from the final rule, quote, "We are modifying our proposal to allow ASM participants in small practices to report the quality measures in the ASM performance category at the TIN level. We believe this would reduce burden for small practices. We will monitor the performance of these small practices to determine whether there is a future state in which we would reconsider mandatory TIN NPI level reporting of quality measures for small practices. We believe that ASM participants in non-small practices would have the same resources and infrastructure to report the quality measures in the ASM performance category at the TIN NPI level."
Wow, there's a lot to that let's unpack it a little bit more. And Brenda, I saw you raise your hand. If you could put anyone has questions, put it in the chat or Q&A. And if we have time, we will make sure to address those at the end of the presentation. And we can definitely follow up directly if we don't have that time. And this model is peer-to-peer comparison with just over 6,600 eligible participants. It's such a small cohort, even once you kind of disseminate that into the subgroups of heart failure and low back pain. So can you walk us through which specialists fall into heart failure versus low back pain cohorts?
Sure. Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward list. So for the heart failure cohort, CMS kept it extremely narrow. So it strictly includes general cardiologists. They specifically excluded subspecialists like interventional cardiologists and electrophysiologists because they act more like proceduralists and they don't typically manage the day-to-day longitudinal primary care of the patient. For low back pain cohort, it is a broader mix of both surgical and non-surgical specialists. So that group includes anesthesiology, interventional pain management, neurosurgery, orthopedic surgery, pain management, and then physical medicine and rehab. And the rule for all these is CMS determines your specialty based on the specialty code listed on the plurality, meaning the highest number of your Medicare Part B claims. And we'll talk a little bit more about plurality in just a bit.
Yeah, and I think, as ASM Connect, we host roundtables, and one of the first roundtables was, wow, we were just amazed by which clinicians ended up on the list and those that did not. So how does the 1-year look back period affect preparation timelines?
Yeah, so it all comes down to the data lag. CMS doesn't wait until 2027 to see what your patient volume looks like. To figure out if you hit that 20 episode threshold, they look back at a full calendar year of your historical claims data. So for example, your final eligibility for the 2027 launch is actually going to be based on the patients that you treated back in 2025. So what this means for your preparation timeline is that the die is already cast. You cannot try to artificially lower your patient volume or change your billing patterns at the last minute here in 2026 to avoid getting pulled into the model because the initial list already came out. Your history's already been written. So because you can't change your past claims, we do recommend that your 2026 preparation timeline, so right now, you should be pivoting toward operational readiness. You need to spend the runway right now checking the preliminary list, immediately updating your PACOS data if you're a subspecialist who might get accidentally swept in, and we'll talk about this in a bit, and then setting up your certified EHR technology. If you wait until 2027 to start figuring out your workflows, you're really kind of already too late. CMS stated this directly in the final rule. We do not expect ASMs to affect subspecialists who treat other conditions, as the ASM cohorts only include Medicare Part B specialty codes. In addition, EBCMs will only attribute episodes to clinicians with more than 30% of episode spending. We encourage subspecialists to ensure their specialty code in PACOS is accurate and up to date to avoid the need to confirm or object to their specialty classification.
Yeah. And you alluded to this a little bit already, but I'm going to, as you answer this next question, I'm actually going to launch a poll about those individuals on the call if you've reviewed your preliminary ASM participant list. So please feel free to answer that question as we go through the next question. So what should organizations be doing if they haven't reviewed the preliminary participant list yet?
Yep. So the first obvious step is to go to the ASM website, check that list immediately. But beyond just scanning for your name, there are some highly prudent and strategic things you should do based on what CMS actually said in the final rule. So first, as I just mentioned, check your PACOS immediately. So ASM pulls your specialty designation based on the code applied most frequently to your Medicare Part B claims, which originates from what you self-reported in PACOS. During the comment period, people raised concerns about subspecialists like interventional cardiologists getting accidentally swept into the model because they're listed as general cardiologists. CMS's response was clear on this, that they will not manually correct your participation status for you. They explicitly told clinicians to go update their PACOS info right now if it doesn't reflect their actual clinical practice. They mentioned this multiple times, and here's one of the direct quotes, right? Directly from the final rule. We note that ASM will not assign specialties to clinicians directly. Rather, we will rely on the specialty code assigned to a clinician's Medicare Part B claims, which is based on PACOS information provided by clinicians themselves, or in the case that a clinician has listed more than one primary specialty in PACOS, the specialty assigned most frequently to their Medicare Part B claims. As we will be unable to correct ASM's participation status to avoid potential errors, clinicians should confirm and provide necessary updates to their PACOS information if they believe that their current specialty designation does not reflect their actual clinical practice. The second thing they can do that you all can do now is eliminate your concern now. So this is good to know. If you check the preliminary list and you are not on it, so you're checking the preliminary list now, or you've already checked it and you're not on it, you can breathe a sigh of relief for the 2027 launch. CMS clarified an important detail in the final rule. For the 2027 performance year, only clinicians who are on this preliminary list will even be considered for the final participant list coming out in July of 2026. So the preliminary list that's already out now can only shrink, it won't grow. It's basically CMS casting a wide net based on older claims data from 2024. They released it early strictly to give anyone who might be eligible a heads up so they can start preparing their EHR and workflows. So the final list that comes out in July is calculated using your actual official 2025 claims data. When CMS runs that 2025 data, some clinicians are going to drop off. Maybe a doctor's patient volume naturally dropped below the 20 episode threshold in 2025. They might have retired. Maybe they use this runway to finally update their PACOS that I've just mentioned multiple times now to reflect that they are subspecialists and are officially excluded. So all those folks are going to be removed from the final list. Basically, with the final list this summer, there's not going to be any negative surprises. They're not going to add any brand new names to the final list in July. So if your name isn't on the preliminary list right now, you are excluded from the model for the 2027 launch. Directly from the final rule, in quotes, We anticipate releasing the preliminary list of clinicians selected for participation for the 2027 ASM performance year based on 2024 data in early 2026. We would then reassess only clinicians on that list for the ASM participant eligibility criteria using the 2025 data. So that's that key statement, because they're saying we would then reassess only clinicians on that preliminary list. So nobody new is going to be added. The last thing you can do is just check your inbox. Keep it, check your contact info, watch your inbox. CMS did state that they're going to be emailing selected participants directly using the contact information they have on file. And they're also rolling out specific educational resources and webinars. I've seen a bunch of stuff pop up on that model website, and we have links in the various slides that we're sharing.
Thank you, Amanda. And thank y'all for answering the poll. It looks like majority of you, 86%, have checked to see if you're on the list. I'm also curious, I'm going to pose this question to you, Amanda, but to the group and the attendees, have you seen these subspecialty issues? Have you been able to resolve them, or do you think they're resolved? And are there any surprises you all have seen or discovered once you reviewed your eligibility data? And Amanda, you're going to talk about patient versus episode, but to you, as Amanda, what are you seeing? Are there any surprises you've seen that organizations discovered once they looked at their data?
Oh, well, aside from what I've already prepared to talk about, surprises about looking at data, which we're going to cover in another slide, definitely that the sets each have one ECQM in them, and it's an ECQM only. People have been really concerned about that because some people are not on cert, and we're going to talk about that. That's a big surprise. And then the use of the functional outcome measures. I think that, again, if you're used to process-based measures, this is a big shift. And then the other surprises that we've seen is the difference between a patient and an episode. So a lot of specialists assume that if they simply saw 20 Medicare patients for low back pain or heart failure, that they're automatically hitting the 20 episode minimum and they're in the model, but that's not how it works. So CMS is using the EBCMs to count your volume, and EBCMs have a strict attribution rules tied to your billing patterns to ensure that you're actually the one managing the patient's care. So if you're a specialist who just did a quick one-off consult and referred the patient back to primary care, you likely won't be attributed to that episode. You have to actively be managing the condition over time for it to count toward your threshold. So long story short, 20 patients doesn't always equal 20 episodes. The other surprise that I've learned is plurality versus majority nuance. So CMS assigns your specialty based on the specialty code listed on your claims, but they don't look for a majority, meaning the over 50% of your claims. They look for a plurality. Here we go again with that word, right? Plurality, which just means the code is applied most frequently. So CMS defines plurality in the final rule. So here's what plurality is in the final rule. Plurality captures the specialty code applied most frequently to a clinician's claims. Majority refers to the specialty code listed on more than 50% of the claims. So in the case that a clinician has more than one specialty code applied to their Medicare Part B claims, the specialty code applied most often would be the specialty code accepted for the purposes of the ASM participant eligibility criteria. We're also finalizing without modification our proposal at 512.710 to include only clinicians with a cardiology specialty code on the plurality of their Medicare Part B claims in the ASM heart failure cohort. And then there's one final one, but this isn't, I don't think it's as concerning, and neither does CMS, but it's just worth noting, is that could be dual TIN reporting for clinicians. I mean, you're already going to know this if you've looked at the preliminary list anyway, but just it's common for specialists to assign their billing rights to multiple TINs. So some organizations are surprised to find out that if a doctor meets the ASM volume threshold under two different TINs, that CMS considers them to be two completely separate ASM participants. So that means the doctor has to separately meet the model requirements and submit data for each TIN NPI combination. Again, although they thought this would happen very rarely, and they stated as such in the final rule. So I don't think this happened with a ton of folks, but it's just worth noting that pay attention. If you're listed twice, that means you have to report twice.
Great. That plurality reminds me of our Medicare savings attribution under plurality. So thanks for bringing that up, Amanda.
Sure.
So the MIPS trade-off, finish this sentence. Oh, sorry. The MIPS trade-off, finish this sentence for us. For many specialists, the first reaction to ASM is.
Yeah, so I'd say based on the comments I saw, the majority of the first reactions are overwhelming concern about the sheer administrative burden and the financial risk of being forced into a mandatory tournament style payment model, where a clinician's payment adjustment depends on beating the majority of their peers each year. They worried this structure could penalize them even if they actually improve their quality and reduce spending simply because they don't outpace the rest of the cohort.
Right. And we talked high level, big picture earlier about the scoring. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that as we talk about ASM scoring. So the scoring split is dramatically different than traditional MIPS, 50% quality and 50% cost. Why is that significant?
So it's significant because it completely eliminates the scoring cushion that we're so used to seeing in MIPS, right? In traditional MIPS, the improvement activities and promoting interoperability categories essentially act as administrative buffers. Most clinicians max them out, they grab these easy positive points, and they end up with a high final score. In ASM, CMS stripped those away from the base score entirely. So your entire base score, as I mentioned before, is quality cost split 50-50. And CMS explicitly stated that they did this to broaden the distribution of scores. So if they kept the MIPS weighting, everyone's scores would cluster at the very top, right? When everyone gets an A, it becomes mathematically impossible to figure out who actually deserves the positive payment adjustments in a competitive peer-to-peer model. Now, naturally, commenters pushed back on this during the rulemaking process. Many were worried that putting a massive 50% weight on cost would incentivize clinicians to withhold necessary care or avoid high acuity patients just to artificially lower their episode costs. But CMS countered that argument by pointing out that the 50% quality weight serves as the critical clinical guardrail. CMS noted that if a clinician inappropriately limits necessary care to artificially lower their episode costs, their quality performance will immediately decline. You cannot drive down costs at the expense of patient outcomes. The model requires you to deliver high value care across both categories to achieve a positive adjustment.
Interesting. I know we all have good intentions, but it'll be interesting to see how this plays out within big health systems that have the same specialist part of ASM and those that are not. But moving on, do you think organizations are adequately prepared for quality and cost to carry this much weight?
No, not really. I mean, the public comments from CMS that they received during the rulemaking process proved exactly that, right? Organizations are definitely facing a culture shock for a few reasons. So first, they're losing the MIPS safety nets, right? For years, organizations have relied on maximizing their improvement activities and promoting interoperability categories to buffer their overall MIPS score. In ASM, those categories offer zero upside. They act really only as potential negative adjustments. So if you stumble on quality and cost in this model, there really is absolutely no extra credit to save your final score. Second, cost is a massive blind spot. I mean, it kind of always has been, right? Like we're used to it being blind, flying blind in MIPS, but with the high weight of 50% compared to MIPS, right? So cost is only worth 30% in MIPS, but here it's worth 50%. So that black hole is even more significant. Suddenly 50% of a specialist score is tied to the episode-based cost measures. And commenters were practically sounding the alarm on this, pointing out that specialists have very little visibility into this retrospective cost data until long after the performance year is over. Several commenters explicitly warned CMS that this lag forces clinicians into heavy financial risk before they're truly ready or have the necessary capabilities to track those episode costs. So it's going to be something to watch and monitor for sure. And then third, the quality cherry picking error is over, right? So I mentioned this before. Participants are going to be forced to report every single measure in the cohort set. They can't just rely on the measures they know that they're going to do well on, as in the MIPS program. So when you combine mandatory fixed measures with a massive 50% weight, the margin for error shrinks dramatically. So no, I don't think most organizations are fully prepared for how unforgiving. I think it's a really unforgiving model that the 50-50 split is going to be.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm going to launch a poll now, asking for those on the call, have you looked at your cost for these particular specialists and episodes prior to ASM? I'm curious if you were already paying attention to this prior to the ASM, if you don't mind answering that question there. And when you've talked a lot, Amanda, about some of the differences between MIPS and ASM, can we dive a little bit deeper into that? And can you explain more about those differences?
Sure. So the easiest way to think about it is that ASM takes the basic framework of MIPS, like we talked about before, so the basics, but it's stripping away all the safety nets. So here's a quick and dirty breakdown of the 5 biggest differences, okay? Who you compete against, so the peer pool. Under MIPS, a clinician's performance is assessed against a massive pool of all MIPS clinicians, regardless of specialty type or the services they provide. So in ASM, you're compared strictly against your direct peers who are treating the exact same chronic condition. So think MIPS, a huge pool, right? ASM is direct. What you report on, so there's no cherry picking, what you actually are reporting on. MIPS and MVPs give clinicians the flexibility to report which measures they want to report. ASM eliminates that choice entirely, so it's requiring mandatory reporting on a fixed specific set of measures that are clinically relevant to the cohort. How you report, so individual accountability. MIPS allows for broad group reporting, which we've discussed. That can sometimes hide the lower performing clinicians behind a group average. ASM is driving direct accountability by requiring participation and scoring at the individual TIN NPI level. How you are scored, so the 50-50 split. In MIPS, all 4 categories generally contribute positive points to your final score, unless you have an EUC or something like that, but in which case it will reweight. In ASM, your score is a simple 50-50. It's 50% quality, 50% cost. The improvement activities and promoting interoperability categories are offering 0 upside. They act strictly as potential negative scoring adjustments if you fail to meet the requirements. And then how you are paid. So this is not about the money, but always about the money, right? This is the biggest one. The tournament model. So MIPS is comparing your score to a prospectively determined performance threshold to figure out if you get a positive payment adjustment or a penalty. ASM ditches that predetermined passing rate of 75% that we're all used to seeing. Instead, it uses a virtual incentive pool where CMS is retaining 15% of the funds for Medicare savings and then redistributing the remaining 85% based on how your score stacks up against your peers. Plus, the financial risk in ASM eventually scales all the way up to 12% over the test period. So it's starting at 9. Yes, we're used to that, but it's going up to 12.
Wow. Well, looking at the poll results, only about 33% of the responses have for sure reviewed their cost data prior to ASM. And I'm sure many of them have already reviewed the data now that they are part of ASM. But let's switch gears. What about PROMs, patient-reported outcome measures? For years, the industry has talked about putting the patient at the center of care, but ASM is actually putting real money behind patient's voice through PROMs, also known as patient-reported outcome measures. How is ASM radically changing the game with patient reporting? And what does it actually mean for specialists' bottom line? And I'll also just note that we've seen this in other new models that have come out. And I think just honing in on the prompts piece, I'd love to get your feedback.
Sure. So ASM is literally putting its money where the patient's mouth is. For a long time, value-based care has heavily relied on clinical data, lab results, imaging, whether you prescribe the right pill, right? The process, we're used to those, check the box. ASM is changing the game by elevating the patient's voice so it directly impacts clinician payments. How this works depends on which cohort you're in. So for low back pain, the shift is happening immediately. So they do have a measure called functional status change. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in another slide, but it's a true patient-reported outcome measure. And it means that specialists are scored and paid based on the results generated from whether the patient actually fills out the survey, indicating that their mobility or function improved over time. Again, we're going to review this more in a future slide because we're going to talk, there's some things that have happened with this measure that I want to chat with you about. And then for the heart failure cohort, there's a little bit more of an on-ramp at this point for 2027. So right now, their functional status measure that they've selected is, if you look at it, it still functions as a process measure and it's still labeled as a process measure. That means the numerator requirement is just whether they actually administered the standardized survey to the patient, not on what the patient's score on the survey actually was. So they're starting to get to that functional status, but it's still officially a process measure. They gave clear indication in the final rule that they're actively exploring how to turn the heart failure survey into a true pro PM measure in the future. So the days really checking a box are over, and ultimately ASM really wants to hold specialists financially accountable for whether the patient feels like they're actually getting better.
Thank you. You and I talked a lot about this prior to the webinar. So I'm really looking forward to that further conversation when we get to the next slides. So let's talk a little bit about the measures within each set. For the heart failure cohort, cardiologists are being evaluated on a risk standardized cardiovascular admission rate. A common fear is being penalized for admissions completely outside the clinician's direct control. How did CMS or did not CMS address this?
So this was a major point of discussion, especially regarding the social risk factors in the team-based care. So to protect clinicians, this measure includes several built-in safeguards, such as exclusion criteria for very ill patients, identification of planned admissions, and a risk adjustment model for clinical demographic and social risk factors. Additionally, to ensure accountability is placed fairly, CMS modified the attribution for ASM so that it only applies to participants who have had at least one visit with the beneficiary. So this ensures participants are only held accountable for the health of the patients that they're actively treating. This is direct from the final rule. About their safeguards. Quotes, the measure methodology has several mechanisms to account for situations when admissions are outside of the control of providers, such as exclusion criteria for very ill or complicated patients, identification of planned admissions, and a 10-day buffer period following discharge, and a risk adjustment model that includes demographic, clinical, and social risk factors. And they also mentioned about attribution, in quotes, to address concerns about attribution and accountability, ASM will slightly modify the measure specifications to attribute solely to ASM participants who have had one or more visits with the beneficiary.
Continuing on with the heart failure cohort, measures like beta blocker therapy and ACE-ARB therapy are notoriously topped out in MIPS, meaning most people already score perfectly or are high performing. Why is CMS requiring them here?
Yeah, so CMS actually believes that the topped out status in MIPS might just be an illusion caused by the cherry picking that I talked about before, right? Because people are just picking the measures they know they'll do well on, whereas their highest performers are picking those measures and they're voluntarily choosing to report them. In ASM, because reporting the entire measure set is mandatory, CMS expects that the actual distribution of scores are going to look very different. Again, it's the whole apples to apples comparison with ASM measures.
It'll be interesting to see what the performance results are for those.
Yeah.
So measure 220, which tracks functional status change. What is important for everyone to know about the inclusion of this measure? We heard there may be some changes to this.
Yes, yes. So this is a, do they know that we know that they know that we know, right? And so I want to read you exactly what they wrote when I said, hi, ASM team, what can we say publicly about the fact that this particular measure is not likely going to be used moving forward? So they wrote back, so it's okay for you to know that we know that you know that we know, right? We have become aware that MIPS 220, functional status change for patients with low back impairments, may not be supported in 2027. The ASM team is aware of this, and we are currently assessing next steps. We will share more information when we are able as soon as possible. So they know and we know, and it's okay for us to know that they know and for them to know that we know. So what I'm thinking is everyone should sniff out the possible changes in this upcoming proposed rule. Possibly wait to program measure 220 until after the proposed rule is released this summer to reduce the risk of coding something that might potentially change, right? Like, so focus on the other measures, right? I'd be surprised if they don't replace 220 with another functional outcome measure. And if they do, the goal for this measure is being a major contribution to the set. It's the same, to measure function over time to see if the needle has actually moved. So I think the takeaway here is focus on the other measures and know that 220 is likely it's going to get replaced with something. It's a timing and a matter of when it's going to get replaced with something. And it's going to get replaced more than likely. I mean, it has to be a functional measure because it's the whole premise of this entire program, of the cohorts, of everything. So they'll pick more than likely another functional measure. It's just a matter of when they're going to do that based on rulemaking, timing, and all that. So look for the proposed rule this summer and see what they say. It's either going to have another one replacing this one, or it'll have TBD, and maybe we'll go 2027 with reporting the other measures in the set, and then in 2028 they'll launch that functional, whatever functional measure they select. So that would be what I would suggest for now, knowing now that ASM is aware, that we're aware, that everyone's aware that, you know, that measure is not going to be supported in 2027.
Yeah. And if it's not and it removes, hopefully they provide a phase-in approach like they do with other quality measures, so that it doesn't hit you 2027 with a new measure that you're not prepared for. And just quickly, I will answer the question in the chat. We will make the slides and recording available to all members post webinar. So please join APM Connect. So we've talked a bit about how tough the 50-50 quality and cost split can be and the penalties for the other categories. But looking at the bottom of the slide, it looks like CMS did, in fact, include a little bit of a safety net. How do these additional points work?
Yeah, so they did throw in a few lifelines. It's just worth noting, specifically to protect smaller practices and those taking care of our sickest patients. So if you are a solo practitioner, CMS is automatically going to add 15 points to your final score. And then small practices with fewer than 15 clinicians, you're also going to get a 10-point bump. And plus, you can earn 10 additional points if you manage highly complex patient populations. So while the base scoring is definitely unforgiving, as we've talked about, the bonus points can help pad your final score and protect you from sliding into that negative payment adjustment territory if you are a small practice. So that's a win there.
That's great. Moving on, we have about 15 minutes left. Let's look at the other half of the performance categories, improvement activities and promoting interoperability. These look very familiar to anyone who has done MIPS, but how do they actually impact the organization's bottom line in ASM? And is there any good news for the administrative teams handling the reporting?
You mean for promoting interoperability and improvement activities?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so we've talked about this. I'm going to narrow it down just a little bit. If you fail to meet promoting interoperability, you're going to get a negative score, right? So these are, if you do these two categories, you just get a check mark. If you don't do them, you're going to get points taken off the score. I mean, that's the long story short. There's a lot more that I could say about that, but the slides kind of say it all. The silver lining that I want you to be aware of, though, is that they originally proposed that practices had to report these activities at the individual level. So in the proposed rule, when they originally launched this, they were going to make everybody do PI and IA at the individual level. And people were like, oh my God, there's no way, especially when you have to do quality at the individual level. So that is the silver lining, is that anybody, regardless of what practice size you're coming from, you can do improvement activities and promoting interoperability at the group level. So thankfully they listened to that with regard to promoting interoperability and improvement activities. But it's just important to note, again, you have to do these improvement activities. You've got to have those CCAs ready, right? With primary care. And then for promoting interoperability, you've got to be on CERT. So it's all stick, no carrot. And you want to make sure that you are on CERT for promoting interoperability 2015 certified with cures, updates, and all the good stuff.
Great. So let's talk about the risk and reward, the financial piece. It's all about the money, right? So behind ASM, because this model introduces significantly more downside and upside risk than many specialists are used to, can you explain the ASM risk curve and why CMS gradually increases the risk level from 9 to 12%?
Yeah, so they started it at the 9% in 2027 and 2028, because really that's what we're all used to for MIPS, right? They know clinicians are familiar with that number, but they're gradually ramping it up to 1%, 1% a year until it ultimately hits 12% in 2031 to slowly turn up the heat. So really the goal is to provide a growing incentive that forces true long-term accountability for chronic care management.
Yes. And we're all used to budget neutrality under the MIPS quality payment program. How does ASM differ from that?
So MIPS is strictly budget neutral, and I have a lot more to say on this in the next slide where it breaks it down. But your bonus is completely dependent on CMS collecting penalties from low performers in budget neutrality. But because ASM is an innovation center model, it doesn't play by the macro budget neutrality rules. So instead of relying on negative adjustments to fund the positive ones, ASM is guaranteeing its savings up front through a redistribution percentage, bypassing the limitations of MIPS budget neutrality entirely. And we'll talk about this in a couple of more slides.
Great. And a key piece here, the redistribution percentage was finalized at 85%. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so it means Medicare is taking their cut right off the top. So CMS calculates the total money at risk, but they're only going to put 85% of it back into that virtual pool, which we'll talk about in a minute. And that's going to be paid back out to the participants, the virtual pool of 85%. The remaining 15% stays in the Medicare trust fund as guaranteed savings. So Medicare secures its savings automatically, and then the specialists are going to compete for their share of that remaining 85%, that pie. They're going to compete for that.
Wow, yeah. So definitely some competition there. And then looking at this, diving a little deeper into the incentive pool, Many people hear incentive pool and assume it works like the MIPS program and the positive payment adjustments. Can we dive a little deeper in what's really different here?
Yep. So MIPS, you're hitting a fixed target score. You get a positive payment adjustment. ASM doesn't have a fixed passing grade. So ASM incentive pool is a virtual pool. It's calculated based on historical Part B payments, meaning no money is actually withheld upfront. CMS then grades everyone on a curve using a logistic exchange function to distribute that exact pool of money. So you're actively competing against your direct peers for a slice of the pie rather than just clearing a static hurdle. So in MIPS, if the passing grade is 75 and your score is 80, you get a positive payment adjustment. It's a static hurdle. ASM is ditching this. It's ditching the passing grade. Instead, CMS grades everyone on a curve to distribute a virtual pool of money. So say your cardiology practice bills $1 million a year in Medicare Part B. Under MIPS, scoring an 80 got you a small positive payment adjustment. But in ASM, you're competing directly against the rest of the cohort. So if the median score for all cardiologists ends up being an 85, your score of 80 is suddenly below average. Because of the curve, that passing grade of 80 might actually result in a negative payment adjustment, which would cost your practice that negative payment adjustment off next year's payments. So it's a pure competition. It's not a standardized test. So let's break down some of the numbers on that. Most important thing to understand is that CMS doesn't they're not putting a giant pre-funded pile of cash on the table. The pool is virtual, meaning that the exact dollar amount, it's going to fluctuate each year because it's calculated directly from the total Medicare Part B claims billed by everyone in the cohort for that year, right? So it's going to change every year. So let's imagine that the entire cardiology failure cohort has exactly $1 billion in Medicare Part B payments during the 2027 performance year. So here's how they're going to build the pool. So the risk cut, the gross pool. So first CMS is going to apply the year one risk level of 9%. So we know that that's that 9% risk payment adjustment to the 1 billion. So that means that 90 million is officially at risk. That's going to form the gross pool. Medicare is going to take their cut, like I just told you, the 15%. That's going to come right off the top. So that's 13.5 million there that Medicare takes straight away. And then you're left with the redistribution pool, right? So that 85% that you're left with is the 76.5 million. That becomes the virtual pool. That's the pie that everyone is working from. So if you score below the median, a piece of your 9% penalty goes into that pie. If you score above the median, you're taking a slice of that pie to earn your positive adjustment. So when we talk about the pool, we're talking about dollars of specialists' own money being redistributed from the low performers to the high performers.
Okay, great. And that's a good picture of how the incentive pool works. Love the pie analogy. I'm going to launch our last poll. And while the audience answers that poll, operationally, Amanda, thinking about everything you shared today, what should organizations be doing today if they want to avoid the future penalties?
So 3 quick things. I know I mentioned this a million times, but update your PACOS data right now so that if your specialty, it's not accurate, you're accidentally pulled into the model, get it updated. Second, you really want to map out your ECQM capabilities because the days of cherry picking your favorite measures are over. And each cohort, like I mentioned, has at least one ECQM quality measure in it that it's an ECQM only. Third, you've got to start talking to your primary care partners to get those collaborative care arrangements set up because failing the improvement activity, like I've mentioned multiple times, it's going to be an automatic 20-point penalty towards your final score. So the whole improvement activity is based on those collaborative care arrangements. So get them set up so that you don't get that minus 20 points off the final score. Stated by CMS in the final rule, because they talked about this a lot. And this is quotes. The goal of the CCA is to set forth expectations between the parties to facilitate primary care and specialty care integration for the benefit of the patient while ensuring both parties are held accountable for how they fulfill their duties.
Great advice. I'm going to jump over to the next slide and have a couple questions, and then we have an additional slide left. So looking at this operational reality check of ASM, let's close with the operational side of this conversation because ultimately this model will succeed or fail based on execution. If an organization leaves today and only takes away the 3 action items away from the session, what would they be? You mentioned 3 already, but do you want to elaborate on any more on those or add to it?
Well, just the participant list and PACOs. So if you haven't looked yet, go in, look, see if you're on the participant list, update your PACOs. I will expand now more on the EHR readiness and the measures, okay?
Sounds
Please
great.
review the measures in the model. We have them all in this slideshow, right? They're on one particular slide where it breaks down both sets, so you don't have to dig through statute. Maybe hold, like I said, hold on investing the resources on 220 until after the proposed rule is released this summer. But make sure you have all the other measures programmed in your EHR and make sure that you know how to document for these starting now, really, so that when 2027 rolls around, you're going to be well prepared and ready to push the data early and often over to Patient 360. If you're not on a 2015 CERT EHR product, we highly recommend exploring this option because it's required for this program and for many other programs within the quality payment program, especially since we know, everybody knows, they've seen it a million times, that RFI that was in the proposed rule on DQMs. I know it's going to take CMS a while, but it's not going away. Like, I've seen it now in multiple proposed rules, which means if you're seeing it over and over again, DQMs are not going to go away. It's where everybody is moving to. So you really want to pay attention to getting on a certified EHR because they're going to eventually have to program DQMs as well. And then you really want to talk to your primary care providers to build the framework for the mandatory collaborative care arrangements so you don't get hit again for that improvement activity. You don't want to get the -20 because you don't have the collaborative care arrangements in place. And then as far as EHR readiness, you know, it's extremely important. So you can't succeed in ASM without certified EHR technology. If you're a small practice, you might get by if you don't have cert because of those buffer points that I talked about. It'll kind of be a wash, but it's going to get you eventually. So I really think if you have the time now to get on cert, you should really explore that. It's explicitly required to pass the PI category, and then of course the mandatory ECQM that's in each cohort. So if your EHR isn't fully set up to capture and report the specific measure electronically, you're going to automatically fail it. And then, the other thing is the PI hardship that some of you are used to using in MIPS for not having cert, that's not even going to be available for this model, the promoting interoperability hardship. So that's something to be aware of.
That's a great call out, Amanda, and lots of great content here today. What role do partners like Patient 360 play operationally in helping organizations manage ASM?
Sure.
And
So we
I'll
help
read out.
streamline.
Okay.
Yeah, you're fine. We streamline the entire process. So you can see here, essentially, we do the submission on behalf of your organization. So if you've completed all the program action items that I just mentioned, you got the participant list, you program the measures, you're using CERT, the next step with us are pretty simple. So you would contact us and you would provide us with your participant list so we can update your contract. And then we basically just add the correct program to the bucket of program options we already have in the Patient 360 platform. And then when you send the measures over to us, they just go into the correct bucket because some people are doing MIPS, some are doing MVPs, some are doing MSSP ACO reporting. ASM is just another program that we're adding on to that. So when the measures come over, they go right into the correct bucket.
Fantastic. With a couple minutes left, looking ahead, do you believe ASM is the beginning of a broader mandatory specialty value-based care model?
Oh yeah, I definitely think the writing is on the wall here. For years, specialists have watched primary care take the brunt of value-based care tradition, but ASM proves that the shield has been lowered. CMS and the Innovation Center have been very transparent recently about their frustration with the voluntary models. They have noted multiple times that when models are voluntary, you get the selection bias, meaning organizations are only going to participate when they know they can win. And they drop out the second that they face real financial risk because it's not about the money, but it's always about the money. So CMS believes that mandatory participation is the only way to get a true and unfiltered look at performance. So yeah, ASM is absolutely the tip of the spear. CMS is using these two high volume, high cost cohorts, heart failure and low back pain, as the ultimate testing ground. If they can prove that this framework works, forcing individual accountability, mandating specific measures, and applying a competitive peer-to-peer financial curve, it stands to reason that they're going to take this exact same blueprint and start rolling it out across the rest of the specialty landscape. So I don't think ASM is a one-off. I do think that it's the new playbook.
I would agree that there's going to be several other mandatory models and expansions coming out, especially around specialty care is what we're seeing, and hospital-based payment models. Thank you so much for the insightful discussion today. lots of great questions in the chat too. So we will follow up on all these questions. Thank you, Sarah, for answering the questions that you were able to. We will make sure that we have the slides posted as well as the recording. It will be available for members. So please join APM Connect.com, and we'll follow up with some email communication of how to access that information. Thank you again, Amanda, and thank you all for attending. Have a great day.